we're doing it. That's the way it's got to be.
But now the questions, I can't see the questions.
Well, I'm going to go back to the questions. Hi, everybody. We are broadcasting live. Welcome.
Having some kind of fun. I don't know what the heck.
No, it's just the screen going crazy because I was trying to figure out how to share the screen. It's kind of cool, isn't it? You know, those of you who like some interesting substances out there will be all right. Well, anyway, greetings and salutations, and welcome to Ask EzeeLinux, Episode 1. I'm Joe Collins, and with me is Jeremy O'Connell from CyberWeb Solutions, and we're going to answer your questions. But before we get into that, Jeremy, tell them who you are and what CyberWeb Solutions is.
Well, hello, everyone. If you haven't listened to the previous recordings of the Mr. Server or Mr. Desktop Mr. Server, I'm Jeremy O'Connell, and I work at CyberWeb Solutions, as Joe just mentioned. And we do a lot of different things online. I run some e-commerce platforms. I also help companies out with, well, programming, setting up servers, middleware, various more remote IT stuff is mostly what I do, but I do help some local clients out as well where I go to their office settings. So if you were interested, you can also listen to that other series I just mentioned. But this is a different series, and we'll see how it goes. Oh, and Joe, before I'll go ahead and get on you before someone points it out. You misspelled questions. So there you go. I pointed out everyone. You don't have to add it to the comments.
Yeah, it's like Queestoins. That's a good one. I swear, man. Hey, after the morning we've had, I don't really care. You all joke on me for misspelling questions if you want to. We had the technical difficulty blues. Them old technical difficulty blues are really bad trying to get some audio from you to hear so we could do this. So I don't even care if it's misspelled. We're actually doing it, and we're going to make it happen. And that's the most amazing and wonderful thing. CyberWeb Solutions, by the way, is the engine that runs EzeeLinux and EzeeTalk. All of that was designed, engineered, set up, even software written for. When you go to EzeeLinux.com, that's what you're looking at. So at the bottom of every page, there's a link to CyberWeb Solutions. And if you need stuff like that done, Jeremy just might be your man. So let me scroll.
I'll just say this real quick. Some people try to contact me through the questions on YouTube. I don't monitor those that closely. So if you really want to get in touch with me for some reason, for some business, or you want to hire me to do some kind of work, please go to cyberws.com. That's cyberws.com, and use that contact form, because I will see that.
Right.
Not a question. Don't just post a comment. Hey, I want to hire you on YouTube. Probably not going to see it.
Right. Go to the EzeeLinux page. Go to the link at the bottom and go to it. Okay. First question comes from Rupert. He says, Happy New Year to you and all of the EzeeLinux community. My question is about your use of used computers. You say that you save money by buying a used computer compared to a brand new computer. This is the case for the initial investment, but how about the higher power consumption of older hardware? Does that make used computers more expensive in the long run? I don't buy stuff that is that old. Okay, we're talking 3 to 5 years at the most. And honestly, unless you're talking about servers, I would guess that the power consumption has pretty much stayed the same over the last few years, unless you know something different about that, Jeremy.
Well, they have gotten more efficient, even the desktops. Each generation of Intel and AMD processors on the user consumer side, such as the I series, or the equivalent AMD series, they are a little bit more fuel efficient, a little bit more. They don't require as much power. So I understand where it's coming from, but unless you're getting a system that's 10, 15 years old, those systems still have the ability to spin down. For example, I'm still on a system that is a Haswell i5 series, which works fine for my needs right now, and it's able to spin down, and it's not the latest generation. And it will go very quiet and start turning off part of its capabilities to save on power. But it is a valid point. If you go get a system that's 10 to 15 years old, it might be cheaper on the surface, but over time you're going to pay more because those can't clock down. So the CPU is running full bore. The main boards aren't shutting themselves down into power modes, or at least turning off certain circuits. So it is something to keep in mind. You might say, hey, $100 for this computer. And then over the life, if you had just bought that $300 computer, you might save money. So I do agree, and that is a very valid point, Rupert.
Right. And the thing is about the when you buy computers used, what I usually do is I go on eBay and I look for the corporate computers, that the big leases that have been refurbished and are up for sale. So those are only 2 or 3 years old. I mean, companies tend to use laptops for, they have a certain set amount of time, like 2 years, and then after that they're going to upgrade, and it's a lease. So those leased computers usually get dumped back on the market, and they're not in terrible shape. They have usually been very well refurbished, and the upfront investment to get into one of those machines, well, it's the difference between $800-900, let's say, for a kind of a mediocre laptop, and then you can get what was 2 years ago a double clutch and water cooled butt kicking laptop for maybe $150 to $250. So that's where the savings is. It's right there. By the way, these questions came to us on the EzeeLinux page. We had a special topic there on the contact that says Ask EzeeLinux. That will stay there. And that's going to serve a dual function. That's if you want to ask a question in the really good ones, should we continue doing this series, which I think we will. What we'll do is we'll set those aside for this show. So go to the webpage if you want to ask questions in the future, and the really good ones we'll hold to the side to answer on the Ask EzeeLinux program. Moving on to the next question, and I really want to get your take on this. I think I've already commented on this enough. This is from Clive, and he says, why do so many talented devs splinter off and work on half-baked spins that fold after a year or so instead of pooling their skills towards mainstream Linux? Is it just egotistical big fish, little pond syndrome? I think that's a really good question, and I want your take on that, Jeremy, because Jeremy's more of a developer than I am. I dabble in it. Jeremy's for real. He writes software. What do you think?
Well, obviously, this is going to be a very general question because when you get to individual levels, it will vary some by the individuals. But my take is that this is one of the strengths, and some argue the weaknesses of the Linux ecosystem. And you can even take that one step further into the open source or free software movement, because you'll see this in things like MySQL and others where you get all these different projects and splinter software from that. The way I view it is, unlike Microsoft, which drives the development of Windows, and Apple, which drives the development of Apple OS or Mac OS, or whatever they're calling it these days, is you have different ideas, and different people want to get their ideas out to the world. And so they'll see something and they say, hey, I have an idea. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always better, but it's just a different take on how to do something. And they will sit down and start working on that, whether it's one man or 5 or 6 people or whatever. And they'll say, hey, let's take Linux and then let's make it do this, like stick a different desktop on it, or write their way of handling audio, or whatever it is. And of course, then you end up with this huge ecosystem with all these different distributions, which I assume the question is really more the distributions, not so much like different, like I said, like
software
like MySQL that's been splintered into several different projects. But if we're just stick with pure Linux itself, the operating system, then you just have different ideas, and people want to express their ideas. And so it can get frustrating to those in the Linux community that are using Linux and saying, hey, why can't we make X piece of software better? Why are we all reinventing the GUI, for example? But at the same time, it's what I was saying, that's a strength of Linux. I mean, there's not one group, and I know even Linus has talked about this, but if we get one group, Linux loses a lot of its appeal. Then what makes us different from Microsoft Windows or Apple OS 10 or Mac OS or whatever. It's just one idea. I mean, the great thing about Linux is you can take Linux, or someone can take Linux, and then like clay, mold it into their idea of what they think well, at least how they feel it should operate, instead of just here's your clump of clay that's already been baked and it's a bowl. What happens if you don't want a bowl? Maybe you want a plate, or maybe you want to make a spoon. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that we would lose something as a community, because while we do kind of spin our wheels in mud at times, just, hey, this isn't going forward. Why? It still allows people to play with it. It brings more people into the Linux community. And over time, that does help elevate us.
Yeah, and I agree with that. But I have vented my frustration on the subject as well because, yeah, when you look at it a certain way, it's like everybody's reinventing the same wheel. But then as the wheel gets reinvented, you get these little improvements that everybody can benefit from. So that's kind of the way it works. And I have vented frustration on that myself. And yes, it seems like it's moving slow, but the truth of the matter is it's moving. So I kind of waffle back and forth. It depends on what day you ask me and what we're talking about, how I feel about that. But I mean, I know a lot of people like I remember I quoted Ike Dougherty, who took off and started Solus, and he wanted to reconstruct Linux from the bottom up, and he did for the Solus project. Of course, Ike has moved back to Intel. He's doing something else. I don't know what his involvement with Solus is right now, but that was a pretty bold thing to do, is to be able to say, no, I'm not going to base this on Ubuntu or any RPM-based Linux or anything like that. I'm just going to create my own distribution from scratch, and here it is. So a lot of the things that Ike did, even if Solus is not the main distribution at the top of the list, have been picked up by a lot of other distributions. And a lot of the code that he wrote, for instance, Ubuntu Mate uses the brisk menu. I know that's your favorite, Jeremy. Well, that's something that came from Solus. So there you go.
Well, you can look at it like cars. I mean, it's sort of like the argument is, well, we should all be driving the same car, and then we
Exactly.
should, Ford and Chevy and Honda and Renault or whatever. I don't all the car brands, Volvo or whatever. Why don't they just make one car and everyone just we can make a really 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 good car if every company around the world just worked on one single car, and then we could have better windows and better whatever. But Ford has their version, and Chevy and Volvo and whatever BMW all have their own take on a car or a truck or van or whatever. And so, but with each iteration, Ford will come up with an idea, and then Honda may adopt it, or Honda may come up with an idea, and Ford may work it in. And yeah, they'll tweak it. They don't always 100% copy it, but they'll like, hey, that's a good idea. So you see little little changes along the way. But
Right.
people keep trying to take Linux and shove it into. It's almost like we should all drive the same car, and everyone should just work on the same car, or whatever the case is.
I think the big frustration that you come up with that is when you get in a frame of mind where you're talking about competing with Windows or commercial products, because that's when I get frustrated with it. And then I have to stop myself and I have to back up and I have to say, but this isn't a commercial product. This is a community. And in a community, people do whatever they want to do.
Well, it's also the strength, because if Linux had been more like Windows or Mac OS or OS 10, it, in my opinion, would not have been adopted as much. What has made Linux so, that's been a flexibility, and the reason why Google and Facebook and Wikipedia and et cetera, run Linux is because they could take the Linux idea and heavily tweak it, even on the commercial side, to do
Right.
what they wanted it to do. They didn't have to say, okay, if we run Windows for our servers at Google, how do we make Windows now do something we want it to do? We can't. We don't have access to the code. And so you have Google has their own version of Linux, and Facebook has their heavily owned modified version of Linux, and that is a strength. So I agree. I understand some days it's like, well, we have this little annoying issue that just goes on and on and on. All we keep getting are different desktop GUIs. When is enough? But you're going to drive yourself crazy. It's never going to stop. People are going to keep playing, and that is the strength of Linux in the end.
Yeah, I agree. Even though in like past videos, you've heard me, I've gotten frustrated with the same thing, gang. It's just the kind of the way it is. Okay, moving on to a question from Musa Youssef. He asks, as an aeronautics and preparing college instructor with a 32-bit Windows computer, mathematics and programming, I guess that's what it is. I misread that. I destroyed that. Sorry about that. Is the following route to Linux okay? Downloads, Linux, which distros, and VirtualBox installations, testing. I think what he wants is a path to a success with Linux.
right?
My take on that, and will always be, the best way to go is to get a second computer that you don't care about, that will run Linux well, and it could be like an HP, Dell laptop, something cheap, a leased computer, something you picked up at a thrift store, it doesn't matter. And then just start downloading ISOs, create images, load it on it, play with it, break it, try it over and over again. Leave your main machine alone. I mean, if you use Windows or use Mac, fine. Don't mess with that. Don't try and do dual boots and garbage like that. Get another machine and play with it. And of course, then you could also do VirtualBox, which he mentions here, but you don't get the hardware experience. That's my take on it. What's yours?
Well, I agree. But if you're in the position you can't afford it, you don't have access to a second computer or whatever the case is, then VirtualBox is a decent alternative. Just be mindful of what Joe said. Don't judge Linux on being slow if you're using it in VirtualBox, because you're not on the hardware, the bare metal is called. And if you're not familiar, bare metal is the machine you can touch, the host OS. So again, if you can't afford a second computer, or it's just not going to work for you, or you're like, I'd rather just find VirtualBox or VMware or something that allows you to virtualize the environment, it'll be good enough to let you at least click on the menus in Linux and use Ubuntu Vanilla or Mate or Mint or something and see what Linux is about. Just again, as we have both said, don't judge Linux on it's slow. Linux is slow. You're using it in a virtual environment. It's going to be much slower in that environment than it will be once you install it on bare metal. So that is a route. And if that's all that's available to you, I say, hey, get started that way. It beats nothing. As far as the downloads, well, 32-bit is becoming harder and harder to get. A lot of Linux distros are no longer making the 32-bit versions. They're still available, but you have to go put more effort into it. So that's a little bit more restrictive when you only have access to 32-bit hardware, unfortunately.
And one of the things I wanted to point out and I run into this a lot from people that ask me questions all the time, is that they go, should I get a 32-bit version of Linux? Is there any benefit to running that even if I have a 64-bit machine? The answer to that is flat out no. Maybe 10 years ago that was true, when the 64-bit was just coming along and 64 was considered to be slightly unstable, that people were saying, oh, you should download the 32-bit version even if you have a 64-bit computer. That's absolutely, positively, completely not true today. And as a matter of fact, it will cause all kinds of issues with like video drivers and stuff like that. So don't even try doing that. If you have a 64-bit machine, get 64-bit Linux and move on from there. Okay, let's go on to the next question. Linux write order. Now, this is kind of, we'll have to address this as we roll along, but I think it's a valid question. He says, and this comes to us from Paul. He says, how do the Linux community decide where to write data on the hard drive? Is it randomly written? I doubt that. And he goes on to say that let's see, I presume it obligates top shelf space for the operating system. So what I'm taking this for, without reading it further, is the fact that he's talking about write order here, which is talking about the actual file system that is used on the hard drive itself. And if it's an SSD, then it really doesn't matter. There's a certain write order that the file system uses. And in most cases, if you start out with Ubuntu or you start out with Debian in Linux, you're dealing with ext4. So the write order is figured out by the team that writes the ext4 system. You want to jump in and help me out here?
Well, yeah, it's a little strange the way Linux community. So just to be clear, so for those who are reading this, and to answer your question, Paul, a software developer who's developing an app is not deciding where to write that data. That's not handled by an app writer like Chrome, for example. Well, that's Google and big, but even if you say Timeshift or something like that, they're handing that off to the file system. So the app developer isn't deciding. So I don't know if there's some confusion there, but just to clarify, so we're on the same page. So if someone's sitting down and writing an app, that's not their job to figure out where the data is written. They just simply hand that off to the file system. The file system then takes that over. But you do have more involved. Like Joe said, you have the file system can say, hey, I want to put this here, but you have to remember that there's more to it. There's hardware controllers and hard drives. If there's SSDs, they have their own little controllers and they run their own little operating system, and they can sometimes say, no, I'm sticking it over here. And in fact, in an SSD, there's a performance hit to have your files together. So the actual SSD may decide, no, I don't like where you're trying to tell me to put this. I'm deciding where I want to put this. So
Right.
it's not, if you're talking Linux community about app developers, it's again not someone, say the time shift programmer saying, hey, write this here. That's what file systems are for.
What I would do if I were you is the one that I know the most about, because I've done the most recent, well, the two that I know the most about file systems for your computer in Linux are XFS and ext4. And a really good place to start learning about just the kind of questions you're asking here is to get on Wikipedia and look those articles up. There's a lot of links that go off those articles that explain more about how this works in general and how the Linux native file systems like ext4, XFS, how they work. Of
now,
course,
did you want to? Sorry.
No,
did you want to go ahead and answer I mean, because this is kind of a big question, but so you want me to go a little bit further into answering his question, or do you want to continue reading some more?
Well, I mean, he just goes on to say, but for all other data, how does it determine where to store in the blank part of the drive? You're getting into how files are allocated through inodes and stuff like that. I think if we start talking about that, we might go over people's heads.
The only thing that I'll say that I just want to add that's more simple than that is because if you're coming from a Windows background, and a lot of us are, I've used Windows at some capacity, there was that common, well, it was all beaten to our heads a lot, like defragmentation.
Right.
Because
Yes.
in the NT file system, what it tries to do is it tries to copy one file after another, after another, after another, after another. And then it was important, at least not on SSDs. Let me just get this very clear. If you're even on Windows or whatever OS you're on and you're on an SSD, do not defrag. It is not necessary to defrag on an SSD. In fact, fragmentation is very good on an SSD. So this only applies to spinning drives. So if you're on an SSD or an M2 drive or whatever else drive you're using,
Let the system handle it. It'll take care of it.
Don't defrag. But if you want to talk for spindles, just as an illustration, it was very important for NT drives and FAT 3216 to defrag. It helped it run faster because that way, when you'd write a file, you'd save your Word document. The system behind the scenes would break it up and put it in little chunks. We won't get too technical, but defrag kind of puts those all together. So when the spinning drive's reading, it can read it sequentially, just one block after another after another. It doesn't have to keep jumping around. Now with extension 4, for example, ext4, is that it actually doesn't put the files next to each other. It will write a file and then it leaves some space so that when you go back to update the file, or you open your LibreOffice document, you click save, it will actually have a little bit of room left over to actually hopefully write that update. So ext4 actually is putting files all over the drive. Again, some of this can be overridden by controllers and stuff, like SSD controllers are a little bit more complex and they can say, hey, we'll do this, whatever. So, but the file system itself can say, hey, don't put this next to the previous file I just wrote a moment ago. Put some space. And how much space? Well, that's all done. You can go read white papers if you want to get super good. So you don't have to, and that's why you do not want to fill an extension 4 drive past 80%, because then you will start getting great fragmentation.
And it's a myth out there that was put out for a long time that you did not ever have to defrag a drive. It was even said there's no way to do that. That's not true. And we're talking once again about spinning drives, gang. I can't say that enough because a lot of people are going, oh, do I need to defragment my drive? The answer is no. There is a tool that does that. It's called E4defrag for ext4. There is XFS has a tool that does that as well. And other file systems may or may not have that available to you. The truth of the matter is that for the average desktop computer, as long as you're not filling that drive up over 85%, you should never, ever, ever have to worry about fragmentation on a Linux system. However, if you have a ton of great big video files, games or something like that that's just taking up huge amounts of space on a drive, then you may consider wanting to run E4defrag. The truth of the matter is that if you run E4defrag on a regular desktop computer, even the one that's been up and running for years, it'll do something, yeah, But will you see any difference in the improvement? No, I mean, improvement in speed? No, it won't make a difference at all. The only time that becomes valid is if you have a very special use case with the file system, and people who do probably already know how to deal with that. So I tell people just not to worry about it on a regular desktop. There's just no reason to.
I agree. And so the only final question that was answered here, or that we can review quickly, if you really truly, because it does say, because overwriting, as it says here, use/deleted data is the best way to secure what has been trashed, because when you delete a file, it just marks that space as free.
Right.
And the data may be there, it may not. It may come back and use that 10 minutes, or it may not use it for a year, depending on, or never. If you just don't fill your drive up enough, it may not write to that ever. And there could be data. The only really secure way to do that, short of destroying the drive, if you don't want the drive anymore, obviously physically, but if you still want to use the drive, you'd have to get some kind of program that would do the DoD, Department of Defense wipe on your free space. You'd have to say,
BleachBit.
Yeah, you could use something like BleachBit or something to say, okay, if you want to be more secure, just make sure you check the right box now, overwrite 7 passes or whatever of unused space. So even if data is still sitting there, it will go write, say, zeros through all the unused space, then go back and do ones, then just random information. And you can do that several times. But if you're listening to this and you're going, whoa, do I need to do that as a regular desktop user? No. But if you're overly concerned, yes. If you're going to recycle a computer, by the way, I always recommend you pull out whatever storage device you have. I don't care if it's an SSD, if it's a spinning, if it's an M2 drive. If you're going to give away a computer, not to maybe an immediate family member, but you're going to donate it to a Goodwill, or you're going to sell it on eBay even, or whatever, always, always, always pull out the drive and either buy a new drive or tell people they got to put in their own media storage. Don't ever hand over a hard drive or a solid state when you're selling or giving away a computer.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, we're moving on. That's a good question, though. Like I said, those are really valid questions, and we could spend a whole show talking about file systems. We could do that. It's easy, especially if we got, you started about ZFS.
Right. Well, you can get very technical, and we tried to keep it a more the 37,000 feet overview.
Yeah, that one is.
Yeah, because it gets super technical. Go read white papers if you want to really. You can get your head swimming on white papers and really low level stuff. But anyway, let's go on to.
I've done it. But I like stuff like that. I'm weird. Okay, Mint desktop debate. Well, no, actually, we're going to ask this real quick question here from Jordan before we get into that. It says, how well is touchscreen and 2-in-1 support on Linux? And that question comes to us from Jordan. And let me tell you, I went through a period of time where I did a lot of one-on-one installs with people. And I found that most of the time the touchscreens worked. I never had a major issue with that. I had one client who called me up and he said, I want to install Linux on this 2-in-1. He went out and bought a brand new Dell. This has been about a couple of years ago now. I don't remember the model number. And I explained to him, I said, well, this may not work. Do you want to go forward with it? He said, oh, yeah, absolutely. He says, I know that it might be a little wonky, but I still want to try it. And we installed Linux Mint on that machine, and I believe it was Linux Mint 18.3. And we did not need to install any proprietary drivers, and everything worked perfectly. But that was for that one machine. So I think the best way to answer that question is your mileage may vary. It depends on what you are using, and it depends on how well the support is for the operating system that you're installing. If you went out to a store and you bought a totally brand new machine and then tried to put like Ubuntu 18.04 or Linux Mint 18.3 on it, you may run into a situation where the modules just simply aren't in the kernel to run that stuff yet because it's so new. So what I would do is before you buy the hardware, simply take some time and research it. And you'd be amazed if you put in model numbers, stuff comes up quickly. You'll figure out how hard it is to get Linux going on something. That's just with any computer that you want to put Linux on. Just put that in there, and somebody out there's tried it, and chances are that's how you'll figure it out. Anything you want to add to that, Jeremy?
Not really. I mean, I defer. I honestly don't have any real experience. What I've heard is more often than not it works, but I would issue just you never 100% know, but probably it will work. But I honestly have no firsthand experience with 2-in-1s. Most businesses don't have I just don't come across it in personally and family and friends and other people I help maintain, no one has a 2-in-1. So that's all I could say to that question.
Well, here's an interesting question, and it comes from John. He says, regarding the 3 versions of Linux Mint, Cinnamon, Mate, XFCE, what makes Cinnamon the flagship supposedly better? Are they ranked as good XFCE, better Mate, and best Cinnamon? As a Mate user who really likes XFCE, I feel there's something wrong with me because I'm not running Cinnamon. I'm told that XFCE has the most customization and lowest resource demand, yet everyone praises Cinnamon. Thanks. Look, if you like what you're doing, do not feel in any way, shape, or form that you should be running something else, because any of the versions of Linux Mint are awesome as far as the polish that they give you when you load that thing up. And what desktop you want to use really is a matter of 2 things: what hardware you're running and whether you like the experience. Cinnamon is more modern, especially now that they've made the changes in 19.1 that I'm not a big fan of, but if you like it, that's okay. And then you've got Mate, which is Mate, and that's a modern spin on the old GNOME 2. And then there's XFCE, which has been around forever. And Linux Mint is going to maintain those desktops. I don't see any reason to jump to Cinnamon specifically because people praise it. It is the one desktop that the Linux Mint project is creating themselves. And that makes a difference. Yes, when you're going to hear Linux Mint and Cinnamon in one breath because they are both one and the same. The Cinnamon desktop is a project that the Linux Mint Foundation is working on, or the project themselves, and they distribute. That's their own desktop, whereas they're just adapting Mate and XFCE. So, Jeremy is a huge Mate fan on Ubuntu, and so, have you considered moving to something else?
No, never.
Yeah. So if you're happy where you are, I wouldn't worry too much about it. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of shaming in the Linux community. It's like, if you're not doing this, then you're wrong. And that goes against the prime thing about Linux, just like we were talking about earlier, is that it's about experimentation. It's about playing with it and finding what works for you. So that's why you're hearing all the talk about Cinnamon on Linux Mint and all the praise, is because they developed that. Whereas the Mate and the XFCE versions and the older KDE version, they're just adapting that. So that's my answer to that question. Anything that you want to add?
Well, that's pretty much it. I'll just echo that. That's why you hear Linux and the Linux Mint and Cinnamon together, because that's their take on a desktop. So you're always going to hear that with at least going forward, and unless they ever decide to abandon the desktop and go like what Ubuntu did and say, hey, we're no longer going to have Unity, we're going to roll with it different. But I don't see that happening. But I would never, this is how I would always say, I agree with what Joe just said. Anything in the Linux community, if it's working for you, stick with it. If you run across a security reason, you read it and they make a decent technical argument or presentation saying, well, you shouldn't obviously have your firewall open to the world. Well, that makes sense. But if you're using a certain desktop or a certain distribution, if it works for you and you're happy with it, stay with it. If you're someone who doesn't, then fine, do whatever. But no, don't feel bad about it. If you like Mate desktop on Mint, keep rocking it, and don't let what the community, like, I agree with Joe. There's a lot of shaming that if you're not using this or that, you're not a real this, that, or let people just, pound sand and yell into the wind. Who cares?
Yeah, there's a lot of people that tell you, they'll come along and they'll say, well, you shouldn't be using Linux Mint because they do this, or you shouldn't use Ubuntu because they do this, or OpenSUSE or Fedora or any of the distributions. Me and Jeremy are Ubuntu people and Linux Mint. I do Linux Mint and Ubuntu. He is an Ubuntu all the way. This is our choice. This is where we're at. But there's a lot of people out there who want to do other things, and I don't go around shaming people. I just say, I'm sorry. If you really, honestly, these days, if you ask me a question about Arch or OpenSUSE, I really can't answer it unless it's a very general question. I don't use those distributions. I don't keep up with them. I stick to Ubuntu, Linux Mint, and Debian, that community. That's what I'm into, and I focus on that these days. So But that's nothing wrong with using any of those if you want to. Let's move on to I thought this was a good question. Linux kernel updates here. This comes from Jay. I have some questions regarding kernels. I use Linux Mint. If the system runs well, can I stay on the one kernel version for a long time, or should I upgrade every once in a while? Is there a recommended kernel version for each distro version that runs particularly well or is very stable? And that is a good question. It depends on how you define version. Are you talking about picking one kernel and staying with it? Well, no, you should upgrade your kernel when security patches come in. But in Linux Mint and Ubuntu, we can choose different series of kernels. My take on that is I choose the current long-term support release kernel and don't budge. What do you think, Jeremy?
I'm that way too. I value stability over performance. I mean, I want performance, don't get me wrong. I love having faster and more supported hardware. But if everything works on the system I'm using, if there's, for example, your video card's not working right or whatever, then sure, that's a technical reason. But assuming for a moment, we're just going to make that assumption, everything works, you're happy with the way it works, and that's what I'm guessing your question is here, then I stay on the long-term support kernel. And then for servers, I prefer to stay, if it's a Ubuntu server, which I don't run as many of, but I do have some, I stay on the LTS, or I use CentOS, which is still on 3.13, but they keep applying the security updates to it. So I value stability over the bleeding edge. Now, if you're someone who's the reverse and you're like, hey, I want the bleeding edge, if you're happy with that and you're willing to accept the issues that may come with that, fine. But in general, I would recommend most people, so you don't have issues, you just stay with the long-term support. So exactly what Joe said, it depends on how you're defining. If you're saying, I'm going to stick with the 4.4.113 kernel, that's not advisable. But if you're like, I want to stick with the 4.4.x series, then keep rocking it if it's working for you.
A lot of people who come to Linux for the first time, especially in the Ubuntu, when they're working with Ubuntu or Linux Mint, because Linux Mint is based on Ubuntu, unless you're using the Debian edition of Linux Mint, they get very confused with the kernels because at any given time, Ubuntu is supporting like 2 or 3 maybe different kernel series at once, sometimes 4, depending on how the support overlaps. And that's because of Ubuntu's interim releases every 6 months and point releases on the LTSs. My trick is, honestly, I just download the first version of the LTS, maybe a 0.1, if whatever, and then hang on to that. And if I'm going to reinstall even 3-4 years down the road, that's what I'm going to do if I'm working with Ubuntu. I'm not going to go to the Ubuntu website and then download version, what are we on, 1604.5 or whatever it is for the last LTS version, because that's going to give you the hardware enablement kernel from that point in time, which is only supported for 6 months. And then upgrading a kernel in Ubuntu can be really scary. It can kill your video drivers. It can do all kinds of stuff. We're talking about moving from one version to the next. Linux Mint, it's a little better, but they warn you, be careful with that. It's very confusing. So what I say, especially for Linux Mint and Ubuntu Mate, if you're starting out, get that early version. You can go to oldubuntuversions.com. Let's say you're going to start with Ubuntu Mate. Get the the 1804 now is the current LTS. So get 1804.0. Download that ISO, install it, and let it upgrade from there. It's the most stable experience you can get. And assuming that your hardware doesn't need what's in the whatever version of the kernel they're using now, and it will run on the long-term support kernel. And most people are using, stuff that's 3 or 4 years old anyway, then it should work just fine. So that's my take on it.
Yep, we can go to the next one.
Next question, and it's kind of, this is the same one. This is the same kind of thing. This is a different Jay. The first one came from Jay, and this is the second one from Jay. It says, I'm using Linux Mint for about a month now, used Windows almost exclusively before, and I'm very pleased with it. I do want to learn more about the different Linux distributions, especially in what aspects they actually differ besides looks. Searching the internet always gives me very general and shallow descriptions about the distros, but I'm interested in the inner workings in order to choose my distribution. I would like to know where I can find this type of information. You got Distro Watch. That's a good place to go. That'll give you a list to look at. What do you say, Jeremy? What's your take on that?
Well, that's a very loaded question, and honestly, we could spend an hour or two just answering this because there's a lot of differences between different distros, and I don't know how familiar you are. I don't know your background in Linux. You say you've been using it for.
He
If you've been
says he's been
following,
using Linux Mint for a month.
yeah. So, but I don't
So
know if
he's
you've been.
new.
Yeah, but I don't know if you've been following Linux videos for a few years now and you just finally made the jump over. So if you're not already familiar, and for those who are listening aren't, you have different families. So you have like a Debian family, and then Debian, well, you have the Linux Foundation, which kind of drives Linux general direction. And then Debian will make their version, and then Ubuntu takes Debian and then tweaks it and makes Ubuntu. And then Mint takes what Ubuntu does and tweaks that. And the Ubuntu Mate project takes what Ubuntu Vanilla has done and they tweak it a little bit. And so you do have different families, and you have the Red Hat family with the RPM systems. So you'll have different package managers. Like in Red Hat, you have Yum and DNF versus the apt, and then you get into. So those are some differences. If you get into the SUSE side, then you have different package managers. If you get into Pacman with some of the arches and so forth, those are differences, but they're similar because a package manager, whether it's say Yum or DNF or apt, you're still doing similar installs,
Right.
but they do work slightly different. I mean, they accomplish the same, but it's kind of like a diesel versus a gasoline engine. I mean, they get you from point A to point B, but one has spark plugs, one doesn't. So the same is true there, that they're similar. Obviously, you said you don't really care about the GUIs; those differ, but those are definitely some differences. Now, there's System D is taking over the Linux world, but there still are some Linux distributions that don't have System D. They're still using the older version, or they have their own spin. So that's something that's different. See, we could get into a long conversation on that. So I'm trying to keep things very general here because we don't have a lot of time to address the
And
question.
the thing about it is that honestly, the main two differences you're going to find with Linux distributions is number one is the package management system is different, but they're very similar. It's like, for instance, if you get into OpenSUSE and you play around with it, you'll find that there's a package management system in there called Zypper, which is really close to apt, which is what is used in Debian and Ubuntu and Linux Mint. And then that's just the way the distribution handles software. And of course, these days we have things like Flatpak, Snaps, which work across a bunch of distributions. So the lines blur, and probably the best thing to do is learn how to use VirtualBox and download and install it. If you have the time and if you have a speedy internet connection, then you can just spin up all these little virtual machines and play with it and poke at it and see what you get while keeping your Linux Mint as your stable system and move on from there. That's a good way to learn. I mean, honestly, that's how I learned about all the different distributions, was just downloading them and poking at them and playing with them. And there's a lot of YouTube videos. There's a lot of write-ups on that, and just see for yourself. Don't really go by what other people tell you is going to work for you. Look for yourself. That's important, I think. So let's move on to the next question, which is kind of sort of dovetailed into that one. I wanted to submit this question in the hopes of getting a proper answer to it here, giving it more exposure, because it's one that I frequently see in the Linux and Linux noobs subreddits. People starting out with Linux using systems like Linux Mint or Ubuntu often ask if they should move on to a more difficult system like Arch Linux and leave their beginner system behind. Perhaps that would be a good topic to clear up in the Ask Linux segment. Or in short, is there any reason to leave an easy system like Ubuntu behind in favor of one that is harder to use? Is Ubuntu/Mint good to use in perpetuity? That's a good word for a learned user. I do. What about you?
Well, I think we kind of addressed this up above, or at least I did. If the bottom line is, if you're happy with your system and it worked for you, then stay wherever you are. If you're just I'm not sure which angle you're coming at. If you're coming at someone who wants to
Oh,
continue to learn.
I know. I mean, I see this question all the time. This is a general question, but it's a question I'm also asked. There is a perception out there with new users that come to Linux that Ubuntu, Linux Mint, the Ubuntu Mate, that those distributions are like starter Linux and it's not real Linux. And then if you want to be a real Linux neck-bearded guru, then you're going to have to move on and learn how to compile Gentoo or build an Arch installation from scratch. If that is your goal, that you want to learn how to do that, go right ahead. But by no means do you have to do that.
Yeah,
No.
and I agree. It's all what come down was what works for you. If you're someone who you get into Linux, you use Ubuntu vanilla or one of the Ubuntu spins, or you use Mint, which is a Ubuntu spin, really. But if you're happy with that and it's working and it's accomplishing all your computing tasks, and you're not really interested in getting into the quote hard or unquote or more difficult Linuxes, then fine, stay where you are. But if you're someone who just wants to learn, you want to further, you want to delve into a system and get more hands-on with under the hood, so to speak, then sure, then go to Arch or pick something else, another distro, Gentoo or something. But the bottom line is, it comes down to what your goal is, and I would never just stop. And if someone says you're not using, you see a comment, if you're using Ubuntu or Mint, you're not a real Linux user. Okay, whatever. Just move on. It doesn't matter. Someone has their opinion. That's fine. They can have their opinion. They may say, again, if you're not on Arch, you're not on real Linux. That's fine. You just do your thing and keep on going.
I have a certain take on Arch Linux. I think that at one point in time, that if you really, if you have a hobbyist's interest in Linux, that this is something that you want to learn about and what makes a distribution tick at a low level, how this actually works, then yes, downloading the base Arch ISO, which is nothing more than a kernel that boots up and gives you a real low-level prompt, and then you set up your own system by following the guide. That can be a learning experience, and it can really give you some idea of how things interplay with each other. But do you have to continue using that system as your daily system because you built it? No, I prefer to use Ubuntu and Linux Mint because they're stable, they're well supported, they very rarely have major issues with breakage. People who run Arch as a daily distro are kind of crazy. It's like you never know when Arch is going to break. An update can come in and kill the system because Arch is just not, that's what it is. It's bleeding edge. Arch is a bunch of building blocks that they give you to play with. It can be a great learning experience. Would I use it daily? Would I use it on a server? Hell no. And it's like people talk about Kali Linux. Kali Linux is a testing distro. That's not designed to be your laptop distro for, doing your computing every day. That's not what it's designed to do. So a lot of these distributions, they have certain purposes in mind that don't necessarily go along with stability. Like Arch, the whole point of Arch is just to give you the latest software, and that's it. That's all there is to it. So if that's what you want to learn about, go ahead. But do you have to use Arch every day? No. I wouldn't. I would not do that. Okay. Moving on here. We're going along at a pretty good clip here. So it says, I've always found your advice to be very interesting and useful in more ways than one, and thank you for that. I guess he's talking to me. One thing that I have often noticed over the years is that more and more people lack common sense and the ability to even help themselves. Searches will generally answer your question and fix your problem because somebody else has had the same problem before you. Who knows? The search result may even link to a solution that you provided in the past. He's talking about either you or me, because how much crap do you have posted? I've got a bunch. I don't know about you.
You definitely have more, but a lot of my stuff, I just have notes and do stuff commercially speaking. But yeah.
So could we talk about the benefit of search engines using simple Boolean expressions like and, or, near, and so on? Just a thought. Cheers. That's Frank. And then I think we have like 2 more questions after that. But anyway, I just wanted to look ahead real quick. My take on it is that I would say that 85% of the questions that people send me through EzeeLinux could have been answered with a very quick search. And that usually what I do is search for the answer and then send them the link. So that's my attitude on it. Yes, you should Google first. What do you say about finding?
Well, I agree. I mean, if you're having a trouble, I would definitely. I mean, you can go to EzeeLinux and talk and run a search there first if you want to stay in the community. But definitely search engines. Turn to it, Google it. That's correct. You can use and or. I mean, we'd have to go further than just flying over at 37,000 feet type to answer that nicely. But yes, get in there and type your and or because that does change it, which you'll get back depending. And so I agree. I do that. I mean, no one knows it all. I don't care who you are. I mean, the computers are so diverse. There's so much going on. And we're all newbies again. You're always, even the ones that are working in server farms. Well, there's a new piece of software to do virtualization that they start learning. There's Kubernetes comes along. I mean, Kubernetes isn't that old. So, there's always new. So don't feel bad if you don't know something. Look it up on the internet. Type it into Google or Bing and see what comes up.
And the more information that you can put into that search, I mean, I think a lot of people have sort of the Alexa thing where they say, they want to ask Alexa, what's wrong with my computer? And then they don't get an answer and they wonder why they didn't get an answer. It's because you didn't put any information in. When you're typing a search into any search engine, Yahoo, Google, DuckDuckGo, whatever you want to use. I mean, we say Google, but it depends. You can use do whatever you want. The more information you give it to work with, the more specific of an answer you're going to get. And sometimes, you need to include things like if it's about your computer, you need to include the model number of your computer.
Right. And I've did this before. I'll get an error on something. I just take the error and type it in at first. Sometimes you have to start backing off. Sometimes you type in, you get nothing. You have to start deleting a few words and hitting again. Nope. And then back off a few more words. And then, there it is. But often we just get some random error or something I've never seen before, whether it's even like a MySQL error or something. I don't know what it is. I'll just type it in and see what help I get. And sometimes that I get a direct answer. A lot of times it just starts, it connects some dot for me. I go, that's related to this. So that means I can look here and then I know what to do. Yeah. But I would always Google it. And again, like Joe said, it doesn't have to be Google. The search engines, the SEs. Anyway.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's move on and talk about Frank. He's talking about compiling. Have you ever needed to compile from source and you just get a bunch of errors? More often than not, usually because dependencies are missing. Any tips for working through that problem? Figure out what dependencies you need before you compile and install them on the system and have them there already. That's the best you can do. Your take.
Yeah, that's I've spent a lot of times back in the day when I was running Solaris servers, there were not ready-made packages for most, like Apache and so forth. Solaris didn't have a nice repo like you can with Linux. And so I had to compile Apache and PHP from source, and I'd compile curl and mod Perl and mod blah, 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 and the list would go on. And it could be quite fun. I mean, sometimes it would take me an hour or two. And if you get into that dependency hell, as it's called, you sometimes need dependency, and then you go try and put that dependency on. There's a dependency of that dependency. And sometimes you need a dependency of that dependency of that dependency. And it's just, I can't give good advice because it depends. You just have to see what the errors are. Google them or Bing them or DuckDuckGo them and just see what pops up and then say, oh, okay, I need this. Or sometimes you'll actually have something, but it's the wrong version and it's showing up as a bad quote dependency, but it's because you don't have the right version. And I've really banged my head on the wall, sometimes literally for hours. And it turns out I just need this one piece of software, and you can get very cryptic responses. Sometimes it's very clear, oh, you need libsane because you're doing something with the scanner, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes you get this very cryptic, and if you just knew you needed libsane, it would have solved all your problems. So
exactly,
search engines are your best friend there, but sometimes you run a search, you don't find anything, and it gets really frustrating. I know. In general, I would say for Linux, stick with the packages, because the problem too, when you compile with source, you must remember it's not going to auto update. So if you need a new version, you have to then go recompile that. And if you recompiled something, you may have to compile something off of that. For example, OpenSSL. When I would compile OpenSSL, and OpenSSH. Anything off OpenSSL, when you update that, I then had to recompile PHP because it was off the old version, and then I have to sometimes recompile Apache, and you have to recompile curl because it's not built against those unless you built against a static. So I just really recommend, when possible now, use the libraries. And that's in your distro.
Yeah, I've gotten to the point where I tell a lot of people, because this is a mistake that a lot of newbies make. I mean, like, somebody's been running Linux for 3 days, and they're looking for software for their system, and they're looking in the wrong place, which is Google or DuckDuckGo. And then they come across, well, I need this program, and the only way I can get it on my system is to compile it. Well, the truth of the matter is that in 2018, if you are providing Linux software and the only way to get it to work on a system is to compile it, you're doing a shitty job, period. You should package it in one way or the other. There are too many ways to package your software that will run across multiple distros. I mean, if you don't want to get into Debian and RPM packages, fine. You can snap it by going to snapcraft.com. You can go to Flatpaks. You can do that. There's a million ways to get software onto a machine that is not asking people to do compiles. It's just, we're kind of past that point. Not to say that there's not a situation where you absolutely might have to do that, but if you're running the system for 3 days, chances are whatever piece of software you're trying to compile, you don't need that badly, because all of the main stuff is already provided by your distribution. You have a software application. There's where you need to look. And don't get caught up just because you go to one website that says, this is the best application to do this on Linux. Chances are there's 25, 30, maybe even 100 other applications that do the same thing. Stick with the distribution and figure out what you're looking at. So that's my take on that. That's what I always tell people, is like, no, don't compile. You'll trash your system. You don't know what you're doing. Until you learn how to do that, take that slow. That's all I'm saying. All right, we got one more here, unless you got something to say about that.
Well, it's a headache. If you're in that situation, I feel for you. I've been in that dependency hell many, many times and banging my head against the wall because I can't build something and it just won't build, and I'm frustrated. I don't know what is missing. It's cryptic answers, and I don't know if you knew it was missing, you can often go bam, 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 but you just have to find that software. And so good luck to you, but I would avoid it if you can. But if you have something that for work, you have to have it, well, Google it or search engine it and see what comes up for you.
Okay, interesting question here. It says, Dear Joe and Jeremy, thanks. By the way, that question above that we just talked to was from Michael, who was talking about compiling. Okay, so we're talking about upgrading with data in place here. And he says, thanks for the great support. Keep up the good work, Joe and Jeremy. What you do is really amazing. Thank you. My question is, how reliable is it, and is it recommended to copy your hidden home folders? These would be ones with dots. When blowing away your existing distro and replacing it with another. If I copy these folders and reload another completely different distro for even a newer version of the same distro, then reinstall all the apps I used to use, how well is it expected that these copied hidden home folders will provide me with all of my old settings and all the other stuff that is included in these hidden home folders when I copy them back to my own distro? Are there any problems between certain distros, versions of apps, etc.? And do I just replace all the hidden folders that were included in my new install? What do you guys know about this? You take it, Jeremy.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good question, because what do you do when you're in that situation? I don't copy everything back, because here's the issue. If you have I don't know what versions you're going to be comparing, but let's say.
Okay, well, let me, I don't mean to interrupt you, but two things I want to get straight up front. First of all, you're going to run into problems if you're going from different desktops. So if you're currently running KDE and then you want to go to GNOME, then what you're going to end up with is a lot of the KDE settings are not going to show up in GNOME because they're very different. If you're staying with the same desktop, then that's not an issue. And the second thing I wanted to put out there was, it's usually okay if you're moving forward. So let's say that you have version 4.2 of Thunderbird and you're moving to version 5.8, and I'm just making the numbers up because I don't even know what the current versions are. I don't even pay attention. Then you're not going to have a problem. But if you're rolling back, you're going to have a problem. That's it. Now you go on.
Well, exactly. You have to watch your versions, and you can very easily introduce an incompatible configuration file because if you roll back or if you switch from one distro type to another, if you go from say Ubuntu and now you want to move over to an Arch, then there could be different settings in there that
Right.
because of the versions are different. So what I personally do when I have this for family, friends, business is let's say that I have the Jeremy user. I want to upgrade or I want to change, blow my system out and reload it. Plus, if you're having problems with the system, why would you copy the configuration files back in there and potentially introduce a configuration error to just give you your problem back? So what I do is I will simply move that over. Let's say I'm at home/Jeremy. I will rename. I'll reboot off the live disk or whatever. I'll go in there into a live image and then I will go home. I'll rename home Jeremy to home Jeremy old or home Jeremy pre-install or something like that. And then I'll reset up my user when I go to install the new system or upgrade or whatever I'm doing. And then I will allow that to cleanly install at the new home Jeremy. So now I have home/Jeremy and home/Jeremy old, for example. And then what I'll do is then I'll copy my data back over. When I set up Thunderbird, I'll copy that over. But I know that then it can typically upgrade because I'm very careful. I'm only copying the user data, not all the like configuration for the program itself. So I'm just copying my user data itself, and I'll keep that that Jeremy old for a month or two in case I run across, I use this program and I didn't grab my update for Terminator or something. I don't know. I forgot it. Now, a lot of that I've scripted now because I've done it enough. I know what I want. I know it's fairly safe. But when starting off, but even so, I don't delete it immediately because sometimes I don't use an app for a month or two. And then I'm like, I changed the colors. I did this or that or the next. And I copy it because a lot of times too, you uninstall stuff, you'll remove stuff, and then you have old information, and then you get this old legacy stuff just hanging out, and it's a good time to clean it up. So that's what I recommend. If you can, something else I've set up for family and friends and business people is I won't store my actual data inside, say, home/Jeremy. I'll set it up, say, home/Jeremy data, and that's where all my Libre documents will go and stuff like that, so that when I reset up the system, I don't even have to touch that. And 95% of my data, my JPEGs, my whatever, my MP3s don't even have to move because that's not where the configurations of the actual programs are. That's just where the data is. Right. So I do that on Sun systems and I don't do it on other systems. Actually, on my current desktop, I'm not doing that, but on some of the servers and some of the desktops I set up for other friends and family, I've done that. I have done that for myself too. So that's something you can do if you get tired of moving your big block of binary data over each time, then set up whatever. Or you can also, by the way, because Linux is so configurable, you can go in there and use fstab if you're comfortable with that. And you can actually say /home/Jeremy/data is then looping back and mounting a different drive or a different place so that it's all in your Jeremy directory. And then the files the programs never know that it's actually, say, coming from /home/Jeremy data or from another drive. That's just kind of we're not going to get into exactly how you do that. But fstab, you can actually mount things and have it inside still your home without having to move data. So it's a good question because, I mean, it comes up a lot when you're updating or you're changing from one distro to another, or you just have a problem and you're on Ubuntu Mate and it goes haywire. That's happened to me a few times with some people, not me personally yet, but someone will come to me and it's just wonky. I don't know what they've done or something, but it's not behaving. As I just blow it out, reinstall it, move their personal data back over. I don't copy that .config folder over in mass. Nope. There may be a few things in .config that I copy over, but 99% of the folders and data is just left there. And I just say, here you go. Here's your system. It's back up and running.
Yeah, I switch. I do what he says. Like I move I might move the Firefox or Google Chrome stuff out of there, but I don't move the stuff out of the cache, for instance, because that's kind of stupid. I mean, there's no point in doing that. And a lot of times that after a while, if you play with these different programs, sometimes it's a good idea if you're using a particular program to look up and see exactly where that information is stored and what you can back up and how you can move it. Because most of the time it's easy, but sometimes they get a little weird and they stick something in a strange place and you go, well, why didn't that do that? So you kind of develop a feel for it after a while. All right, last question. We have done really well on time. I can't believe we've gone a little bit over. We set ourselves to an hour. Probably going to be about an hour and 10 minutes. That's fine. We can do this. One more question. Turning back the hands of time is what I said here. Hi, Joe and Jeremy. This has caused me trouble throughout the years and significantly slowed my entry into the Linux world. System boots and screen turns black. This has happened after a general Linux update or after installing an NVIDIA video card and switching from an XOR driver to NVIDIA driver. Is there an equivalent to Windows last known good configuration or Windows safe mode? Can the Grub bootloader, while looking at the OS menu items, be told to use a generic video driver so I can log in, see the desktop, and fix the problem? What would you suggest? Thanks. Best wishes for you success in Ask EzeeLinux. That's from Ken. Go.
Well, there's several things. First of all, you can use programs like TimeShift if you're more GUI centric, or I have written an app called CYA, Cover Your Assets, and that actually creates snapshots. It's like the system restore in Windows, and it will roll back your system, and you can control how often that runs. You could run CYA every day, or you could run it once a week, or just manually before you do some updates. Here's what I've noticed, though. I have noticed this greatly on desktop Linux. I personally have been bitten by doing updates when the desktop's been running for a while. I always reboot that when updates come in that are for the core system, not for Chrome. I will reboot the system, apply the updates, and then reboot the system again. I've noticed if I'm someone who doesn't like turning my desktop, my workstation off. I'll let it run for 10 days straight, 2 months if I could. And I've noticed, though, that if you go apply updates from that, you can get things like you mentioned where the video driver doesn't go right. But here's something else you have to remember and keep in mind as well. CYA is a great tool for that. But you can, a lot of newbies don't understand that just like in Windows, you could go into a safe mode. There's kind of a safe mode in Linux, but what that is you can go to a previous kernel. And often it will still load because not all the updates have been applied to that kernel. Sometimes they do compile, and you'll see like it going through and compiling modules for that kernel. But a lot of times you can actually boot off the previous kernel, and more often than not, that will work. And so you can, if you're on say 4.4.141 and the updates don't go right, unless you went ahead and removed it before rebooting, which I hope you didn't, you can go to 4.4.139, and more often than not, Linux will load. And then you can either remove that offending kernel because it's messed up or potentially undo the updates. The third option, just to be very thorough with you, is you can boot off of a live image, whether that's a CD or DVD or a USB stick or even over a network drive, kind of jump starting it, if you will. You can then boot into and potentially chroot into your environment and fix it. Now, that's a very advanced way of doing it, but I want to throw that out there. I have had to fix systems that way. And that's how you fix a system, by the way. If some friend or family comes in like, I forgot my password, help, I'm locked out. Well, you can boot up, chroot into it, and change the password to anything you want, and then say, here you go. And they're often like, yeah, you didn't know my password, you said it. It's like, yeah, it takes like 5 minutes to do it. Usually takes longer to load the live environment than it does to change their password. So that's why a physical machine, if you have physical access, is not secure. But those are options. Again, something like TimeShift or CYA. But again, Cover Your Assets, that's a terminal-based recovery system, and it will roll your system back. But I would always also recommend that you reboot the system before applying major updates. Like I said, if you've been running it for 3, 4, 5, 6 days, you've been doing a lot on the system, I've just noticed some bad data can get in there and really mess with the updates. And I have had systems, my personal, the one I'm talking to you on, not restart correctly. Thankfully, right. I could reboot into a previous kernel. You hold shift or whatever down, you get into the kernel. I select the previous kernel, it boots right up. But I have been bitten. I've never been bitten since I restart the system. It seems to work really well. I did that 2 days ago. I restarted my desktop, then applied the updates, then restarted it. Just seems to be a little cleaner because it's usually a GUI thing that goes on more often than not. For some reason, servers rarely have that. I've rarely had servers applying updates because there's just less on the server. You don't have this big GUI environment in general and all that. So those are what I recommend. And if you want to get more advanced, you can look into booting up off a live image and chrooting. So what do you say, Joe?
My thing with most general users is I tell them to set up TimeShift or CYA, or those are the two programs, and they both have their ups and downs. TimeShift is very pointy, clicky, and very easy to set up, and it generally works well for graphical environments. If you are a little bit more adventurous and you want to learn how to work in the terminal, you can really fine-tune CYA. Also, if you have any sort of software or hardware RAID on your system, then you're not going to be able to use TimeShift because TimeShift is looking for a standard like SD drive, SDA, SDB. That's what it's looking for. And if depending on how your RAID is managed, you might not have that. It doesn't work that way. So the CYA is a definite. That's the first one that I go to if I'm doing RAID for sure. So there's ups and downs, and you can find out more about CYA by going to the EzeeLinux page and then clicking on Bash scripts, and it's like one of the first things listed there, and you can learn about that program. And then I have several videos up about TimeShift. TimeShift is available through a PPA for Ubuntu. It is baked into Linux Mint because Linux Mint is more I'd say a bit more new user friendly, and really learn how to use one of those two applications or both. And then you can always roll back. And like Jeremy said, get used to the idea of being able to jump into that grub menu and then roll that kernel back. That helps a lot too when you're trying to troubleshoot stuff, because even if CYA or the other one, TimeShift or whatever you happen to use rolls you back, you're still going to have to deal with that update. So yeah, it can roll you back in time, but you still might have a problem that you might have to address there. So that will give you some time to figure that out for sure.
And this is an advantage going back. I know we're getting long. I need to wrap this up, but this is an advantage when you stick with Ubuntu Mint, that you generally have less of those issues than if you go with Arch or Gentoo or something like that. Those are generally where you're going to have more problems.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and I have had like Linux Mint has been good to me for years, especially 18.3. I've got systems that I have upgraded since Linux Mint 17 that, upgrade in place that have never done that to me. I've never had a problem. I've never had a major problem with that on Ubuntu myself. I usually, like I said, we tend to set them up and let them roll. And if you do that, it's very stable. And the most stable of all is what?
You mean Linux?
Yeah. What's the most stable you've ever seen?
The most stable of any Linux to me
is Linux.
CentOS to me is the most stable.
Absolutely. I agree. I thought you'd jump right in with that because we were just talking about that, is that CentOS, which is what the server runs, the EzeeLinux page and the EzeeTalk is on. That's what it's there.
I've never had a CentOS server crash that was related to the OS. I've had it crash when I had a Ceph failure on a cluster, but that was
right. Yeah.
And we had to do some stuff to help rebuild it, but it wasn't that hard to get it going. But I of all the servers I've managed over the years and everything, CentOS, I've had Ubuntu. I don't run Ubuntu servers, but I've helped people to administer it, and I've had seen some clients have had problems with Ubuntu servers on the OS. I'm not talking about, say, Apache's not doing something funky, but CentOS, the OS itself, I have never seen a more rock solid Linux distro than CentOS.
Yeah. All right, man, we're going to wrap this up. I want to thank everybody for watching thus far. Thank you very much to Jeremy for being here, because we had them technical difficulty blues, and we poked at this thing for like 2 hours before we were able to actually record it. Some people have asked about doing this live. That may or may not happen in the future. It's scheduling, gang. It's hard to pick a time and stick with it. So we'll see. We'll roll with that and see how it goes. And of course, we're definitely going to be looking for your feedback here on YouTube, and check out EzeeLinux on the web, because there you can send something on the Contact Us page under the Ask EzeeLinux there. Also, check out EzeeLinux on Facebook if you're a Facebook user. And of course, check out EzeeTalk, because EzeeTalk is a forum that is specifically for the EzeeLinux community, and it is safe and fast and secure. We run that ourselves. That's not through Discord. It's not through some other service. We're totally in control of the database and the security of that, so we can pretty much guarantee that it's very secure. So any final thoughts, sir?
Well, the only thing I'll say is, once again, obviously I'm Jeremy O'Connell. A few people have reached out, but if you want to get a hold of me for commercial reasons or hire me, you need to go to cyberws.com and go to the contact page, or go to ezeelinux.com and go to the bottom and click on the link that takes you to CyberWS. I don't monitor the comments on YouTube very much. So if you just post a comment saying, hey, Jeremy, this, I sometimes go through and look through them, but that's not the best way to get a hold of me. So go to the CyberWS website and use the contact information listed there. That's it. Thank you for listening. I appreciate it. And send in more questions if you have them, and we'll see about doing another one.
Yeah, you can, and like I said, we're going to leave Ask EzeeLinux up on the page there. So if you send a question, it's a really good one. I might grab it, and then of course, if you have specifically for the show, then you might want to put that in your note there to let us know, hey, this is specifically for the show, and then that will work just fine the way that is. So anyway, we're gonna wrap it up. Thanks, gang. Look forward to hearing your responses. Thank you, Jeremy. I'm out of here. Talk to you all again soon.
Goodbye, everyone.